They dragged her across the church floor like some kind of animal. The same hands that once held a Bible now held her face down in the dirt. She could hear the town's holy man whispering things no preacher should ever say. And the sheriff, the one wearing the badge of law, he just laughed as she begged them to stop. June Avery had come to this town with a dream of honest work. She believed in God. She trusted the men who wore the cloth. But underneath the chapel's roof, all she found was a cage. Night after night, she was mocked, slapped, bruised. Her cries were swallowed up by the church bells, the same ones that were supposed to be calling people to prayer. When she finally got out, her body held every mark of their cruelty. Bare feet torn by rocks, lips swollen, skin burned by ropes. Her soul was shattered, knowing the most powerful men in the whole county were the ones who had broken her. The sun was going down when she stumbled out into the open fields. Every breath felt like glass cutting her lungs. Each step was a roll of the dice between falling and pushing forward. The town behind her slept, hidden in the long shadow of men who thought they were above the law. The preacher ruled their souls, the sheriff ruled with his gun, and the judge just turned a blind eye for both of them. Nobody dared to question it. But June had run all night. Her legs gave out right beside a lone oak tree. The prairie wind whipped the torn shawl that barely covered her body. She pressed a hand against her side, trying to stop the bleeding. Her eyes darted across the field. If they found her out here, there wouldn't be a second chance. And that's when a figure stepped out of the tall grass. A weathered man with a dusty hat, his face etched with years of sun and heartache. His name was Silas Beckett, a rancher who had buried more than one loved one right in this soil. He knelt down next to her without saying a word, his hand reaching for the cloth wrapped around her waist. Her voice cracked with pure terror. "Please, don't touch." But his hand had already moved the torn fabric aside. He just froze. The bruises told a story too evil to be real. Wounds across her hips, rope burns on her wrists. It was the kind of violence no accident could ever explain. For one long moment, Silas couldn't move. The girl was shaking in front of him, broken but still alive. He saw his own daughter in her eyes, even though his daughter had been in the ground for years. The whole world tilted. He finally understood the truth. No one had the courage to speak. The evil tearing this town apart wasn't coming from outlaws in the hills. It was coming from the very men sworn to protect it. June whispered again, weaker now. "They'll come for me." Silas clenched his jaw. The sound of the wind through the grass felt like the very voice of judgment. He had just stumbled into a war he never wanted. But could he really walk away? What can one lone rancher do when the preacher and the sheriff stand together like monsters in the eyes of God? Silas didn't leave her under that tree. He lifted June into his arms as if she weighed no more than a sack of feed. Her head fell against his chest. The sound of her shallow breaths kept him moving, one step at a time, through the dry grass. The ranch was quiet when he brought her inside. Old floorboards groaned under his boots. The house smelled of dust and wood smoke that had long since burned out. Silas laid her down gently on the bed he hadn't touched in years. It had belonged to his wife. The quilt still held her faint scent. For a moment, he just stood there, a widower staring at a stranger who looked half dead. He opened the cedar chest at the foot of the bed. Inside was a dress, wrapped in yellowed cloth. It was the only thing of his wife he had never been able to give away. Silas placed it beside June. This belonged to someone who knew pain, too. She found a way to live through it. Maybe you will, too. June pressed the dress to her chest. Tears carved paths down her dirty cheeks. He shut the door and turned a key on his own past. She told him everything. The preacher, Elijah Crow the sheriff, Wade Greeley. The way they held the whole town in fear. The girls they kept hidden. The nights no lawman dared to question. Silas listened without moving. Each word was a nail being driven into his own chest. He knew Crow and Greeley had power. Friends at the courthouse, hands in every pocket from the banker to the judge. Going up against them wasn't just dangerous. It was nearly impossible. Yet here she was, one broken girl, asking him to believe her, and behind her story were others, still locked away in the dark. If he turned away now, he'd be no better than all the others who had stayed quiet. June looked at him, her voice low. "You believe me, don't you?" Silas reached for his hat and pulled it down over his eyes. "I believe you, and that makes things real hard for both of us." The old rancher knew a storm was coming. He just didn't know how soon a knock would rattle his door. Was the first man to come searching already on his way? The knock didn't come. It was heavier than that. A fist pounded on the ranch door like it wanted to tear the hinges right off. June flinched so hard she nearly fell from the chair. Silas raised a finger to his lips. He gestured toward the barn. There was a false wall he'd built years ago to store grain during bad seasons. Now, it would serve a different purpose. June slid inside, clutching the dress to her chest, and Silas pulled the board shut. The door banged again. This time, a voice followed. "Open up, old man!" "We know she came this way." Silas moved slowly, steady. He unlatched the door and faced the man standing in the dust. It was Colton Pike, one of the sheriff's hands, a brute with a grin that showed more rot than teeth. "Evening, Pike. What's all the fuss about?" "You know what it's about. The preacher's property. Don't tell me she didn't drag her sorry hide through here." Quote. Silas tilted his head, calm as a still lake. He let the silence stretch. A hawk circled overhead. Inside the barn, June held her breath. Every creak of the wood sounded like thunder in her ears. Pike pushed past Silas, sniffing like a bloodhound. He stomped across the porch, peered into the barn, and even kicked at a few hay bales. For a second, June thought he would rip the boards right away, but his eyes never found the seam. Finally, Pike spit in the dirt. "You always were a stubborn cuss. Just remember, old man, standing in the way of men like us never ends well." He climbed on his horse and rode off, dust rising behind him like smoke from a fire. Silas stood in the doorway until the sound of the hooves faded. Then he pulled the boards open. June crawled out, pale and shaking. Her eyes begged a question she couldn't speak. He answered it anyway. "They'll be back, and next time they won't come alone." The girl lowered her head, clutching the dress tighter. Silas looked past her, out at the endless stretch of land, and he made his choice. He couldn't just hide her. He had to do something bigger. And if you're still with us, you know this story is only just getting started. Go ahead and subscribe so you don't miss what happens next, because the fight for justice has only just begun. Next time, we'll see where Silas dares to take June and what old friend will rise from the past to change everything. The night after Pike came, Silas made up his mind. He saddled the old bay horse before dawn. The ranch still slept under the heavy blanket of prairie fog. June climbed up behind him, clutching the borrowed dress like it was armor. They rode in silence for miles. Every hoofbeat felt like a drum echoing against the canyon walls. June leaned against his back, her eyes half closed, fighting to stay awake. She trusted him now, though her body still trembled at every snapping twig. Silas kept his eyes on the horizon. He wasn't heading toward the town. He turned north, toward the hills where an old telegraph station once stood. Few people remembered it was now an outpost for federal riders. Silas didn't know who ran it. He just hoped someone there would listen. By mid-morning, the small building came into view. A flag stirred weakly on its pole. A man stepped out onto the porch, tall and broad-shouldered with iron-gray hair. For a long second, Silas thought his eyes were playing tricks on him. It was Tobias Hart, the boy he'd ridden cattle drives with 30 years ago. Back then, they had sworn they would die with their boots on. Now, Tobias wore the star of a United States Marshal. The reunion was brief. Tobias saw the girl, her bruises, the fear written all over her. He didn't need a lot of words. Silas explained enough. Names were spoken: Crow, Greeley. The other girls still trapped. Tobias's jaw tightened. He ordered his men to saddle up. Within the hour, riders thundered down the valley carrying writs of arrest. June gripped Silas's arm. unable to believe what she had just witnessed. For the first time since fleeing the church, her eyes held more hope than fear. Silas knew this was only the beginning. Men like Crow and Greeley didn't just give up without a fight. And the town was still under their shadow. Would the preacher and the sheriff surrender quietly? Or would their darkness spill blood before the truth came out? The town would never forget the night the riders came. The church doors swung wide open, not for prayer, but for justice. Elijah Crow was pulled down from his pulpit right in front of the very people he had deceived. Sheriff Greeley was stripped of his badge before the same men he once commanded. Their power just crumbled in the light of the truth. The girls who had been locked away in the cellar were carried out one by one. Some were too weak to walk. Others cried when they saw the morning sun. But they were all free, and freedom tastes sweeter when it comes after being in chains. For June, it was more than freedom. It was a chance to live again. She stayed at Silas's ranch, helping care for the animals, cooking simple meals, and even laughing for the first time in months. The borrowed dress no longer felt like borrowed sorrow. It became a symbol of survival, passed from one woman who had suffered to another who had endured. Silas never asked for a single word of thanks. He just went about his chores the way he always had. But sometimes, when the day's work was done, June would sit with him on the porch. The prairie stretched out before them, golden and endless. The wind carried the sound of a bell tied above the door. Each time it rang, it reminded them both that hope had a sound. Their story leaves us with a lesson. What do you do when the people who are supposed to protect you are the very ones causing the harm? Do you look away, or do you stand up like Silas did? Even when the odds are stacked high against you, sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is simply believe someone who has been silenced. June found her voice again, because one old rancher chose not to walk away. And maybe that's what courage really looks like. Not loud, not shining, but steady and faithful in the darkest hour. If this story touched you, give it a like so more folks can hear it. And if you want to follow the next tale from the Wild West, make sure you subscribe right now. There are more stories out here in the dust, waiting to be told.